Well, good afternoon and welcome to the first in a series of ControlPoint webinars that we will be delivering during November and probably into December of this year. My name is Martin White. I work for a company called Storexltd. Storex is a relatively small consultancy company based in the UK. What makes us different from most other IT organisations is that we are focused on delivery of solutions based on one product and one product alone, that product being ControlPoint. Where that has taken us over the years is we're probably now known as the leading providers of ControlPoint solutions within the UK, if not across Europe. As an organisation, we've developed and delivered solutions throughout Europe. Quite recently, we've just deployed a 5-site ControlPoint deployment in Germany, Spain, the Channel Islands, Ireland, and the UK. And really our focus is purely on how ControlPoint can help our customers really to regain control of their unstructured data. So today, I really want to just give you a flavour of how ControlPoint could possibly assist you and your organisations to understand the makeup of your data and how you can start to control that data, really to make better utilisation of your IT resources, physical IT resources in terms of storage, your backups, restores, replication, but also enable the business to respond to any regulation or any requirements concerning the makeup of the data. So what we're going to talk about really is this relentless growth in unstructured data, because we've seen some massive growth throughout the last couple of years, and it just seems to be growing and ever increasing. And the solution that we want to talk about today is called ControlPoint, which enables you really to manage the data from creation through to deleting of that data at some point in time. ControlPoint is a solution that manages unstructured data. And probably the good place to start is, well, what do you really define as unstructured data? In quite easy terms, that's anything that's outside of a relational database. So, for example, mainly if you can consider any documents that we create, so Word documents, spreadsheets, PowerPoint presentation, PDFs, video files, audio files, images, extending to email messages, SharePoint data, anything that's not directly inside and controlled by an RDB, we classify as unstructured data, and ControlPoint can help you to discover and manage that data going forward. This actually raises a really interesting point because about 4 weeks ago we started working with a customer who had a fairly large well-known CRM system, and based on an Oracle database, and that's fairly easy to ensure that you're compliant because the schema really describes the layout of the data and the data type. But this particular CRM vendor had one particular column which was classified as free text, so it allowed the users of the application to enter free text inside the application and ultimately install inside the database, which presented a massive problem because how can you find PII or sensitive information that's randomly placed about? And that's exactly what unstructured data is. So we were able to help this particular customer with their CRM system by looking at this particular column inside their database to identify the areas of concern so they could address it. So although very much out of the box, ControlPoint is managing unstructured data, it's very versatile in that it can be tuned to provide solutions for your particular business. Why have we got this challenge? Well, as I mentioned before, unstructured data is growing rapidly year on year, and we've very much grown up with this kind of culture within many organisations with the fear of deletion. So we tend to want to keep the data forever, just in case. And of course, that just in case never happens, but it just simply grows. And that puts stress and strain on our IT technology in terms of we need more storage infrastructure to hold that data. It puts stress and strains on backing up that data, and more importantly, restoring that data. If we're replicating it to third-party sites, then there's a lot more of that data needs to be replicated, especially under the initial sync. And what's the really interesting fact is most of this 40% growth is made up of unstructured data. And I think the figure quoted that's on the screen at the moment is around about 90%. And the other interesting fact is of this data growth, 80% of that information is rarely accessed after 90 days. But again, this culture that we've had over the years is that let's just keep everything forever because we might need it one day. And of course, now with new regulations, that's no longer possible. We really need to understand the content of that data so we can make some informed decisions about how to manage it going forward. So let me take it back to really, the bare essentials, if you like. How can we put a nice analogy together for our unstructured data? And probably everybody has one of these kitchen drawers, which contains probably everything at some point. We've probably got multiple copies of the same thing in there. We've got items that we didn't even realize we had. We've probably got items in that we shouldn't have. So what ControlPoint can apply to data is really that streamlining process so that you understand and you can make informed decisions about what you need to keep. This is what we want to achieve in terms of this characterization of our data to make it very streamlined so the business understands the makeup of the data so we can make some informed decisions about what we do with that data going forward. We've seen in 2018 the introduction of GDPR, and many organizations took GDPR as a bit of an opportunity to start to automate some of their data retention policies. In 2019, we've seen the same happening, but we've also seen many organizations receiving DSAr requests, data subject access requests, where individuals, the subject is asked for how much data do you hold on me? What is that data you've got on me? And can that data be removed? Now, for most DSAr requests, once you've acknowledged the receipt of the request, you then have 20 working days to actually respond to the user. And that responding is not only finding the data, it's making sure the data is delivered in a reasonable form. You're not allowed just to give the subject boxes and boxes and streams of paper. You have to present the information in a reasonable format. Now, it would be okay if most organizations had 10,000, maybe 20,000 files on their file share, for example. Maybe you could, in 20 days, manually search that information for different criteria and actually form a reasonable response back to the subject. But unfortunately, we don't have 10 or 20,000 documents. Most organizations will have several million documents. So it almost makes that manual task an impossibility. And that's where solutions like ControlPoint really stand alone, enabling you to find that data very, very quickly, very efficiently, and then be able to do further analysis on that data to ensure that you actually deliver the data that is correct. Many solutions on the marketplace today, including ControlPoint, do not provide an end-to-end DSAR solution. They very much form part of your DSAR process. And for ControlPoint, it's all about how to locate and find that data, how to characterize that data so that you can make informed decisions going forward. So how do you start to regain control and start to tame your unstructured data? And I'd like to give you a few examples of how ControlPoint has helped a number of our customers. Just to summarize, ControlPoint really is managing the life cycle of unstructured data from the left-hand side of indexing the data, ingesting the data initially, so we can collect the metadata, so we can look at the aging characteristics of files, the ownership of files. But we also start to collect the content of the files, so we can identify, for example, any particular IP information that's relevant to your organization. Is that stored in the right location? Is it exposed? But also look for example, sensitive information. how many CV documents have we got out there from many years ago that we're no longer should be keeping because they're not relevant to our business? So again, ControlPoint can help you find and manage this data. And I say management because the last cog in the ControlPoint solution is the ability to apply some policies. And a policy, for example, could be to add additional metadata. It could be to migrate the physical files to a different tier of storage, or even to implement a disposal procedure. All those movements, all those actions upon the physical data files are all recorded and stored within an audit trail, which is part of the ControlPoint solution. So providing you with a full map of the history of what's happened to data throughout its life cycle. Here's an example of a customer we dealt with quite recently who initially wanted to do a 3-month study to get some idea of the makeup of their data, which wasn't a problem at all. So we scanned roughly 2.5 terabytes of file system data and then performed what we called a ROT analysis. ROT stands for redundant, obsolete, and trivial. Redundant are basically duplicate files, so files that contain the same content. They could be stored in different locations, owned by different people, called different file names, but the contents are identical. The middle donut on the screen at the moment, obsolete, is basically any file that hasn't been modified or accessed in the last 5 or more years. And then on the third donut, trivial, are any files that actually you decide shouldn't really be on our system. So maybe they could be iTunes folders or maybe temporary files. So, but you can define a series of different file extensions that we can classify and pull them together. So in this example, this customer, as I said, we ingested 2.5 terabytes, over 5 million files, and 1.6 terabytes of this data was classified as ROT. Now, does that mean, for example, the following day you can suddenly remove 1.6 terabytes? No, it isn't. But it gives you an opportunity to start removing some of that data which is not required by the business, and slowly moving the fence down to make it more heading towards your goal. So initially, for example, this particular customer was going to remove any files that haven't been accessed in the last 10 years. Once that was complete, we're going to drop the fence down to 9 years and so on. And that was ensuring that there was no impact to the business. Give an example, I mentioned duplicate files. So again, within ControlPoint, it's very easy to identify those files. So on the left-hand side, displayed up on the screen at the moment, you can see what we call duplication sets. And these are the files that are made up of duplicates. So for example, you can see on the left-hand side, there's a presentation that's highlighted. On the right-hand side, you can see the number of duplicate files that are associated with that particular item. The asterisk on the right-hand side is the original source file, and then you can see the other files where someone has renamed it, given it a different file extension to try to hide it, but because we're looking at the contents and the contents are identical, we can identify these files. So in the background, ControlPoint could have a policy, for example, to identify duplicates and maybe move the duplicates off to a different physical location to store them temporarily before they're removed finally. A few other examples of some of the screens that are available via the GUI front end. We can look at the rate of addition of files, so how many files have been added over time. Very useful for capacity planning exercises. We can look at the average size of files. So we can look at the classification. So you can see the large screen in the bottom middle basically shows the a classification of all the different file types. So as you can see at the top, around about the 7th bar in, is something called documents that would contain all the Word documents, all the PDF documents, rich text formats. So it's just forming a classification for us to get a high-level view of the makeup of our data. Lastly, on the bottom left-hand side, ControlPoint can use some of its machine learning capabilities to try to understand the meaning of documents based upon its contents. Based upon its meaning, it can start to group documents that have similar content together. And what we're showing here is almost like a heat map, showing documents which contain a similar subject matter. So we can start to drill down and form categories based upon the content, the meaning of files within inside the system. Another useful example is, and many customers we've implemented this, is just to identify some risks associated with their files. So for example, on the left hand side you can see 3 bars. The first bar, which has got 881 files associated with it, probably contain one piece of PII information, maybe a personal name, which has a risk associated, but probably is a low risk. The second bar, which has 502 items associated with it, is classified as medium risk. It probably contains 2 pieces of sensitive information, a personal name and maybe an email address. So it's actually aimed at an individual slightly more, as opposed to just a personal name where there are thousands of people with similar names. And then the last bar, the high risk, probably contains 3 pieces of PII information, but does point to an individual. So probably a personal name, an email address, and maybe a national insurance number. So by using this very simple technique, we can actually represent the risks associated with data within inside your organization, which is very important to ensure that your files that might contain IP information, might contain sensitive information, are placed in the right location within inside your organization. So for example, maybe high-risk documents should be placed on an encrypted drive. Because the key thing here is, if any of this information is lost to the outside, then you have to be aware of the risks of that data that's been lost, so you can inform the relevant parties and take some action. Again, many customers will start to engage with us where we would do like a preliminary investigation into the system, really to try to identify the amount of personal or sensitive information that might exist inside their data files. Quick example of the type of files with the data associated with it. So for example, on the left hand side, these are all different kind of categories that we search for, ranging from purely sort codes with personal names, and also a bank account detail, all the way through to job offer letters, CV documents. So a customer can begin to build a picture of the, I suppose, the exposure that they might be risking. And with this information, you can then start to understand the importance of really managing some of this data, or identifying some of this information that maybe you shouldn't have any longer, especially in terms of like CV documents. Typically, we find on a file system, it's on average, it's around about 20% of those data files contain PII, and the 20% is not aimed at a document that contains a single piece, so a single personal name. This figure is really based on where we have multiple occurrences of PII information inside a single data file. This number varies across market sectors, obviously, but 20% is probably a good average to start with. So I'll give you a very quick overview of how ControlPoint, what it does and how it's helped a number of customers. I'm going to show you the product working in our demo environment. So as I mentioned, there are several stages to ControlPoint. Actually 3 stages. The first stage, which is shown on the screen at the moment, is the repositories. This is where we form our areas that we're going to ingest. This is where we tell the system the different data sources that we want to ingest. We want to look at that data, and this is where we perform our ingestions. Once the ingestions is performed, the second stage are categories. Categories are where we create our business rules. We start to perform that classification. So we start to identify the files that contain that information, or, for example, a category could be the number of duplicate documents we solely have. So we can have categories formed on pure metadata, pure content, or a mixture of both. Then lastly, and thirdly, on the right-hand side are the policies. So the policies can then take action upon the categories. So we could ingest our data, identify all the duplicates, and then have a policy to take some action on those duplicates. maybe to move them to an alternative location, maybe just to add additional metadata to them to say they've been investigated. And that's very much the life cycle of ControlPoint. So let's go into the repositories to begin with to show you an example of what a repository actually is and what it's made up of. There are 3 tabs inside repositories, so registered, analyzed, and managed. Registered is where we've initially created a repository to be ingested. We haven't performed any analysis, we've just done or performed the ingestion routine. And you can see I've got 2 on the screen at the moment. Here's one I created earlier today, and I'm just going to edit this repository just to show you the kind of makeup of what you need to define, because it's fairly simple. Here you give it a name, a description, and then you tell it the type of data that's going to be ingested. In this particular type, it's going to be a file share, so hence file system. If it was going to be a 365 email account, we would specify exchange. And by the way, the exchange connector can do either on-premise, 365, or both in parallel. So you've really got that flexibility. If it was SharePoint, we'd use the SharePoint connector. If it was OneDrive, use a OneDrive connector. So you're basically you're defining the repository is going to be of this particular data source. Once you've defined that data source, you then tell it what you want to ingest, what particular areas. So here you can see I've got 2 shares which I'm going to ingest data from. And these will ingest sequentially. So the first one will complete first, then move on to the second one. If I wanted to run them in parallel, I could create 2 separate repositories, and they would do their own individual sources in parallel. You can tell the system to include or exclude file types. In this case, we're not, so we're going to simply do everything. The final stage is really you define what type of analysis you want to perform on the ingestion once it's complete. So it could be on the left-hand side, pure metadata. So that's only collecting the metadata from the header information of the files. So things like the name of the file, the owner, the size, last access dates. Through to content, which will collect all the metadata, but also collect those and build those content indexes based upon the information stored within inside the files. The other options we have switched on or switched off, capture permissions and ownership information. So we're going to collect the ACLs associated with the file and the person who created that file initially, the owner of the file. If we wanted to do, to open container files, so for example, if we found a zip file or a PST file and you wanted to index the contents of those files, then you would need to switch on Analyze Subitems. You may recall earlier I mentioned that we can look for patterns, credit card numbers, national insurance numbers, and this is what we call eductions. So if I wanted to specify a credit card number or a bank account number, this is where I would specify them, and there are around about 200 to 300 which are supplied out of the box. So for example, if I wanted to add a regex expression, a grammar, for maybe a bank account number, you can see there are predefined for us different bank account formats for different countries. So for example, if I wanted to select the GB, I can then get the option of doing the UK sort code only or sort code and bank account number. And that was, so for example, if I want to do both, I would just add them to this particular repository. And that's it. You then start, apart from you can schedule it to run on a regular basis, that's all you need to define. Once that's defined, the data will be ingested for us. The second stage in repositories is that you can take a repository and you can analyze the contents. When you analyze the content to do a ROT analysis, the repository will move to the Analysis tab. Here's several that I've created earlier. And you can see, so we've got different types of repositories with different analyses that have been performed. PST files only. We've OCR'd some documents, so we've taken some image documents, run them through an OCR component, and then we've indexed the content, so it's all searchable for us. We've got Microsoft have recently introduced, it's been about for quite a while now actually, is a method of labeling. Azure Information Protection it's called, but you can assign labels to files. So ControlPoint has the capability of discovering those labels and then acting upon those labels. So for example, if you wanted to make sure that your files with a particular label, maybe it's a finance label or a confidential label, are being secured and assigned properly, then we can go and find those labels for you across all those files. We've got OneDrive, we've got 365, we've got SharePoint. I've also, just for, I wanted to get some data on our system, so I installed a web connector. So I've actually gone out to a website and ingested some of their data so I can make that searchable. And maybe if we have time, I can show you that. But we're going to go into a file system, which is training data. So this is just a number of file shares that we have on our system that we've pulled some data, we've ingested some data. So you can see here's the ROT analysis. So we have almost 700 megs of redundant files. We have some aged files and some trivia files. We will identify, this is the status of the last scan. So there were 3 files which we couldn't understand the contents of those files. There were 3 which were password protected. Now again, if we want to find out what those files are, we can click on that and you can see password protected files, and these are the 3 files that have been highlighted to us. So for example, if I wanted to understand how they've been protected, because I can't collect the content, but I've collected the metadata, I can probably find that at the bottom it's probably been protected by some form of encryption software. I'll just scroll right to the bottom and you can see here it's been protected by RMS, which is part of the Azure Information Protection solution. So going back to the summary screen of our training documents, we've got the initial items for how, the makeup of the data, when our data was created. So in terms of items and space that is occupied. And as I scroll down, we can get the categorization that was done in terms of the document classification. So I mentioned before, documents will contain all the, docs, the docx's, the PDFs and so on. But we've also looked at some content and we found some information, some files that might contain credit card information. They're really interesting thing around credit cards because in essence it's a 16-digit number we're looking for. But ControlPoint will actually validate that 16-digit number that it finds. So if you find, for example, Cisco part numbers or other items which are just 16-digit numbers, if they won't validate as credit card numbers, so we're able to reject those and really eliminate false positives. And again, I can click on the credit card and it would take me down and show me the number of occurrences. So I can see this person here in our AD system. So Merit M has 1 file. I can click on 1 file and here's this file. It tells me contains credit card numbers. Let me show you one other thing before we move on to categories. So maybe I want to look at the aging characteristics of my files. And I'll look for the last modification. When was these files last modified? And you can see that I've got a number of spreader files, and if I look at the 10 and over years, there's only 1 file, and that will appear CV was created many moons ago. And again, I can click on this to look at the additional metadata, and you can see originally that the document author was the Warwick Business School, and you can see that it contains some personal information, probably of the person applying, so the person who owns the CV, but probably some references, some referees inside this document. And maybe because it was created, a long time ago, 2000, almost 10 years ago, maybe there's no reason for us to have this document on our system because it does contain PII information. So that gives you a very quick overview of how we can do a ROT analysis. Let's move on to categories, just to give you a flavor of once we performed the ingestion, how we can really start to use that data to form some classifications. So for example, I've created a number of type of categories, and I've got one called PII, which I can expand, and maybe all these different criteria, all these business rules allows me to go and search for information. So maybe we'll do banking details. So this, I've run this rule, it's come back and told me these files contain some form of banking information. Let me show you the makeup of that rule. So on the right hand side, we've got the ability to add new, or we can modify. So I can edit the existing rule. And what it enables us to do is to go through into this kind of training environment, to really to define what our rule is made up of. So the first section, we basically give it some high-level general information, the name of it and a description. And then we go into training, and this is where really the magic, I suppose, happens. Here I've selected, the first stage is you select your area you want to search. I've selected one repository, but we could simply select any of those repositories that we've ingested data for. And then I've got, because it's a content ingestion, I'm looking for the word sort code has to appear, but I'm also doing some form of proximity operator to say that the basically within inside the document, the word account and number or account and name has to be adjacent to each other. Hence the word, well, the number 1 represents the proximity, so they have to be next to each other. But I've also extended that and said, well, in this document it has to have account name or account number within 5 words of sort code. Okay, and that's how I've started to build this rule up with inside. Now, once I've run that, I can run that rule automatically. It would go out, search and find that information for me. And again, any of this information I can then what else can I show you? So I've done some other things looking for passwords, for example, passwords that might be, you know, there's some form of password, username and passwords have been stored in files incorrectly. I mentioned DSAr requests. So right to be forgotten. Here's being able to search for different items. Let me show you that particular rule. And I'm going to add some other criteria just to make it slightly more suitable. So here we're looking for Martin White, and so Martin White has to appear within inside the document, and it also has to contain Hewlett-Packard and Barclays at the same time. And this time we're searching 3 repositories. We're doing a OneDrive, or my OneDrive account. We're doing my mailbox, and also the training repository on the system. So we run the results. And you can see that it's found 30 files, and you can see the occurrence of Barclays in here, Hewlett-Packard, and I can almost guarantee that this is probably a document that I created when I was working for Hewlett-Packard. So it's very simple, it's very easy, and it's very efficient to be able to find the data that you require. There's one other thing I haven't shown you, I'll just touch on very quickly, in that if you don't want to create or tell the system how to look for data, I'm going to show you this category, in that we can actually give the system a number of documents and say, hey, these are the documents I want. Can you go and find the others for me? So we can give it some source documents, which it will then learn from. It will then go and, from its learning, it will then go and find other documents which contain a very similar content. So, for example, if I drill inside here to show you these are all PDF documents that we've described on the system. We've given it as the training source. And when we run the results from a different location, it's come back with Excel spreadsheets which contain a similar information. So we're not just looking for identical documents. It is being based upon the contents of the documents and it's finding. It will find other document types, I'm sure, as we go down. There's some PDFs at the bottom as well, but they are from different locations, and that's really the exciting thing. Lastly, policies. So policies allow you to take some action, and I've got a number of policies on the system, from archiving, so delete. So this particular archive moves files and then deletes them. Other policies which are adding additional metadata items. There's some other. I'm actually using SharePoint to move as a target location. So I'm moving some files from a file system and I'm storing them within a SharePoint environment as the target location. So there's lots of methods of moving, lots of policy you can define to act upon your data. Let me give you an example. If I go back to categories and I look under ROP management and go into duplicates, and I go into duplicate zip files, we have a policy on our system to look for zip files automatically. If it finds any zip duplicate files, then it removes them. So we've only got one on the system. The little kind of cross represents that it's actually been moved and it no longer exists on the file system. At the next incremental scan, that file will no longer exist on the file system, so it will be removed from the repository. The reason why I'm showing you this, I'm going to go back into the policies, I'm going to go into archive, and here you've got a history of the zip files it's found. So this is what's initially found on the system, and then it's applied the policy to actually remove the files. And on the right hand side are the files that have been disposed of in this case. Now we can set up, for example, if a file is marked to be has been identified under a policy, some action to be taken. For example, we can set up for notifications so that a user would be notified and for approval before that policy could actually be executed. So we've got the option of having a review process or no review. So that's a very quick tour of ControlPoint and some of the features. So last couple of slides, just a quick summary. So again, as I mentioned, there are 3 key stages to ControlPoint. Stage 1, you ingest your data. Stage 2, analytics to really identify the contents, build those categories. Stage 3, the policy engine to take some action upon those categories to do something with the data. So what can we do to help you? So we're in Storexltd are in a pretty unique situation where we are the only UK and European partner that can provide ControlPoint on a subscription as well as a perpetual method. The subscription method works really well because, as I mentioned earlier, that if a customer wants to do maybe a 3-month investigation before committing to the product, we can offer a 3-month subscription where we would work with you to find that information and to show the value that ControlPoint can add to your organization. The subscription opportunity or model also gives you the ability to start smaller and be very flexible. So you can grow as your data grows, but you can also shrink as you start to manage your data. So initially, if you were ingesting 5 terabytes, after the first year, maybe it's gone down to 4 terabytes. When you renew your subscription, you can actually drop the subscription. So it gives you that very flexible, very agile approach. As an organization, everything for ControlPoint is installed on site. There is no cloud hosting of your data. Your data is critical to your business, is sensitive to your business. So ControlPoint, irrespective if it's a perpetual or subscription license, is deployed on site in your location inside your data center. So it's fully controlled and nothing ever leaves your premise. And it's also hardware independent, so it doesn't matter what hardware you run ControlPoint on. It's typically run on a number of Windows virtualized environments. And that's the beauty of ControlPoint, because it's a very modular solution. You can very easily scale the solution as volumes of your data increases and you want to ingest more and more. So really a call to action. Hopefully you've taken anything away from today, is that there's lots of rot data out there in many organizations, typically on average around about 40%. I've seen some organizations much higher in the 70s. Generally, we find about 20% of file system data contains PII and sensitive information, and that's not just one, that's not personal names, that's 2 or 3 occurrences of PII information in a single file. And it also gives you a good chance to start to build your kind of retention policies, but also automate those retention policies. Having a retention policy in a paper form is one thing, actually implementing that to do something is another stage, and ControlPoint can really bring that together and make it work. So that's all really I was going to go through today. If you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email. My email address is martin.white@storexltd.com, or give me a call on my mobile at any stage. If you're interested in finding out more about ControlPoint, possibly how we can help you do that initial data cleansing, that initial data investigation to find out the level of PII, maybe on a 4-week, a 3-month engagement, we can easily do that, and we'll be delighted to work with you. Thank you for your time, and I will speak to you hopefully fairly soon. Thank you.